Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. As you know, we are doing Song of the Lark by Willa Cather. So I hope everyone has dug yourselves out of the massive amount of snow that we accumulated yesterday. Or maybe it was the day before. But we shall advance. Jane and I were talking, and we were saying how fabulous it is that we don't have to worry about canceling classes because there's too much snow. We don't have to do that at all. So now I will record this for you and upload it to YouTube. As you know, I will do this later today. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a chronology and some background information. Those of you who have taken my courses before know that I like to establish a context. I think it's very important in understanding the author's point of view and the author's purpose, and I think that Willa Cather's own life experiences do play into our character Taya in Song of the Lark. Some of this may be a review from past Cather's classes, but I think we're going to just go ahead and do it again. I'm not absolutely sure what I might have told you in past classes because I think you knew this, my computer crashed last semester and I lost everything. So it was pretty much a do-over, but that's okay. I think it's, as I said, important that we understand Cather and where she came from. She was born in 1873 to Charles and Mary Virginia Cather in Back Creek Valley, Virginia. I know we usually associate her with Nebraska, but she didn't really move to Nebraska until I think she was about 9. Interestingly, she was christened Willella and called by the nickname Willie throughout her childhood, but later she adopted the name Willa. She created that herself. She's the eldest of the couple's 4 children, who also included brothers Roscoe and Douglas and a second daughter named Jessica. In 1877, Cather's family moved to Nebraska, Webster County near Red Cloud. Although the Cather family had long been established in the Virginia community where Willa was born, a general westward migration of family members sparked by the railroad's opening of the Great Plains states and the push to increase settlers was already underway by the time of Cather's birth. Her uncle, aunt, and grandparents had already left Back Creek for Nebraska farming community of Red Cloud when Charles Cather decided to follow in 1883. In 1884, they traveled by train to Red Cloud. At the age of 9, Willa Cather arrived in the region that would provide the setting for most of her best-known works. O Pioneers, for example, was set here. The tiny area where the Cathers and their relatives established homesteads had already come to be known as Catherton, but that did not increase Charles Cather's luck as a prairie farmer. After an unsuccessful first year, he sold his homestead and moved his family into Red Cloud, where he began a farm loan and insurance business. Gave up the farming thing. It was in Red Cloud that young Willa passed the next 6 years of her life becoming an avid reader and diligent student whose sharp intellect and forceful personality left a lasting impression on friends and teachers alike. There's a scene in O Pioneers where the main character wanders around the community and talks to some of the settlers, the people who had come there from, who had emigrated from other countries. And this is, in fact, what Willa did. She made friends with some of the other eccentrics in the area. In 1890, let's see, in 1890 she graduates Red Cloud High School and delivers a graduation oration in the Red Cloud Opera House, much as Jim Burton does in My Antonia. Cather's sister is born also in this year. At the age of 16, in 1890, Cather left Red Cloud for Lincoln and the University of Nebraska. She was 16. After a year's preparatory study, she entered the school and quickly established herself as one of its brightest and most individualistic students. Severe and mannish in her dress, she was self-confident and sometimes aloof in her manner, and she was already beginning to establish herself as a writer. An editor and contributor to the campus's 2 literary magazines. She also had 2 articles published in the Nebraska State Journal, to which she began contributing a regular column during her junior year. I thought it was interesting. This was a little tidbit that I found. She was the editor-in-chief of the school's yearly the yearbook, and that assignment soon changed to one of the paper's theater reviewer, a post that she held until after her graduation. I was kind of thinking that perhaps if Willa Cather was the editor of her yearbook, perhaps that boded well for me and my future writing career, since I too was the editor-in-chief of my high school yearbook. I'm just kidding. She earned a reputation as a tough and eloquent critic, impatient with the third-rate fare often served by touring companies from larger cities. In 1893, Cather's grandmother, Rachel Boak, who was the model for several of her other characters, she died in 1893. And again, Cather manages the 1895 University of Nebraska yearbook. I think we literary people do that. We manage yearbooks. In 1893 and 94, she serves as the managing editor of the Hesperian. She graduates the University of Nebraska in 1894. A year after her graduation in 1895, she moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she would remain for the following 10 years. I know we always picture her to be firmly set in this Nebraska town, but she did move quite a bit. For much of that time, she lived with the family of her close friend, Isabel McClung, with whom she made her first trip abroad in 1902. There are several women people who are going to figure in some of Cather's character developments. Around this time, Cather worked as the editor of Home Monthly magazine and taught high school. She continued the writing she had begun in Nebraska and published a book of poetry in 1903, and she became a collection of short stories in 1905. That was called The Troll Garden. The following year, Cather moved to New York to work for McClure's magazine. 6 years later, she published her first novel, Alexander's Bridge. That was in 1912. That same year, Cather made the first of many trips to the American Southwest, where her brother Douglas worked for the Santa Fe Railroad. There, she visited the ruins of cliff-dwelling Indian structures and discovered the striking vistas and ancient culture that would play an important role in several of her later novels. Cather's next work, however, was O Pioneers in 1913, a story set among the landscapes and people of her Nebraska childhood. The book earned critical acclaim, as did her 1915 novel, The Song of the Lark. So it was published in 1915. Our novel examines the career of a singer. And while Cather was not a singer, much of the book is a discovery of the personality as an artist, the development of the artist, kind of like James Joyce. Portrait of an Artist. This is the same kind of development. In 1896, Cather is appointed editor of the Home Monthly, magazine, and moves to Pittsburgh. I already said that. Um, Interestingly, she will never come back to for any extended period to live in Nebraska again, and yet much of that childhood, much of what she learned from there, becomes enmeshed in her fiction. Okay, we have here. In 1899, as I said, she meets Isabel McClung, who becomes her principal emotional interest until some years later, McClung marries the musician Jan Hamburg. Um, Apparently, that marriage stunned Willa to a great degree. She didn't see that coming. In 1901, I think I mentioned this, she's hired as a high school teacher in Pittsburgh, which she continues to do until 1905. She was worried about her ability to be a writer. And, what did people do? Women became teachers. She visits England and France in 1902. From this point on, France will assume a far larger role in her cultural poetics than will England. Let's see. In 1903, she meets someone named Edith Lewis, who is to become her life partner. There's quite a bit of discussion, and I'll get to this in a little bit, about whether or not Willa was a lesbian. There's a lot of discussion in the literature about her. And the bottom line is that no one really knows. She didn't say anything about it. She does make long-term relationships with other women, and we'll get to that. But it was very interesting that some of the research about this concept of her being a lesbian never really came to anything. Whether she was or not almost becomes irrelevant because her fiction is so superior. Let's see, in 1906, she leaves Pittsburgh to assume a position in New York City. I already said this, at McClure's Magazine, one of the most successful and popular literary and muckraking journals in the United States. She forges a respectful partnership with the magazine's founding editor, S.S. McClure. Okay. In 1908, Cather meets Sarah Orne Jewett. She assumes the post. I already said that. In 1910, she meets Elizabeth Sargent, another one of these women friendships that was so important to her. Soon to be another close friend. Let's see. I didn't write down the page number. But anyway, in 1912, she resigns her position at McClure's to devote herself to her creative writing. Alexander's Bridge is published. Cather and Lewis rent an apartment in Greenwich Village. Cather makes a crucial visit to Winslow, Arizona, beginning a lifelong engagement with the American Southwest. Page 10. As you can see, I've got lots and lots of notes. Page 10. I lost my place here. 9, 10. Here we go. Cather was by this time deeply committed to Isabel McClung, the handsome daughter of a prominent Pittsburgh judge who enjoyed challenging the city's Presbyterian propriety by mixing with artists. We've seen that before. Um, Women who or artists who mix with the literary people, not consider like with Wharton, it was not considered desirable. The two women's friendship had deepened to love, and in 1901, McClung rescued Cather from her noisy boarding house and brought her home to live. In the following 6 years, Cather enjoyed for the first time the comforts and social connections that come with wealth. She was happy living in a family setting again and was able to recreate her childhood nest in a private attic study. When Cather was a child, they lived in a very small house, and her parents recognized the intellect that Cather possessed, and so they made way for her to retreat from the rest of the family and the busyness of the family by creating a little nest. That's what they called it. They created a nest in the attic. And that's where Cather would retreat to read and to write, even as a child. Interestingly, though, it wasn't heated, so she would sit up there, wrapped in blankets and pursuing her reading. She did the same thing at McClung's house. But Cather was ambitious and had long contended that the demands of an intimate relationships were a hindrance to the serious artist. We're going to see that point, especially in Song of the Lark. There is a conundrum between what you can have personally and what you need to pursue intellectually. Okay, so in 1913, O Pioneers is published. Cather agrees to write S.S. McClure's autobiography. When published in 1914, my autobiography includes no credit to Cather. In 1914, during an interview, Cather befriends opera singer Olive Fremstad, who is said to be the model for the character Thea Kronberg in the novel The Song of the Lark. This relationship, this friendship with this Olive Fremstad becomes really vital to the development of Thea. Let's see. Olive Fremstad was a Wagnerian opera singer. And let's see, page 7. Olive, she already knew that Fremstad interested her most, but after meeting and interviewing her, Cather found her feelings about the singer grew deeper and more complex. Only Fremstad, Cather concluded, was equipped with the talent, intelligence, and dedication to reach what Geraldine Farrar had termed the frozen heights of perfection. Cather was really interested in Wagnerian opera. And Cather wrote Sargent, that this is Elizabeth Sargent, that Fremstad's presence left her profoundly moved, choked up by things unutterably. From watching Fremstad both on and off stage, Cather recognized how completely the singer lived through her roles, how little of the person was left for anything else. As an artist, both enjoyed and determined to reach the frozen heights. And that's in quote, the frozen heights. Fremstad had only one great passion, her art. And that was an important concept to her, to Cather, this concept of her art, the devotion of her art. Okay, let's see. This given to me by Jane. It was a very interesting introduction to Song of the Lark. We don't have much of an introduction in our text. This one was very good. Let's see. Cather herself had protested to the puzzled Elizabeth Sargent that while most artists almost desperately link themselves to lovers, spouses, children, as if to avoid being devoured by art, Cather herself wanted to be so devoured. Cather understood that lovers or children could never fully share such an impersonal mission. And that's an important concept. It's an important independent mission. Nor would they be satisfied with the husk of humanity left after the artist's vitality had drained away. Although personal attachments would always be alluring in times of loneliness, they could never satisfy this artist's ambition or fulfill her dreams. Cather was shooting beyond personal relationships to this frozen height, and that's how she defined it. Like Cather, Fremsted, the opera singer, had been an immigrant to the prairie in her adolescence. Fremsted had artistic gifts that were out of scale with her surroundings, yet those surroundings still left their mark on her, making her seem strangely familiar to Cather. Let's see, in 1915, as I said, The Song of the Lark is published. Cather visits Mesa Verde for the first time. She then travels to Red Cloud and begins to work on My Antonia. In 1917, Cather returns to the University of Nebraska to receive a doctorate of letters. In 1918, My Antonia is published. Cather's My Antonia is recognized as one of her major works. It's a story of an immigrant girl's life on the Nebraska plains, draws its inspiration from many actual peoples and events. And that is pretty characteristic of Cather's characterizations of people. She draws on people that she met and liked or met and thought were interesting. In 1920, she travels to France. While there, she visits the grave of her cousin, G.P. Cather, whose death in World War I and letters written home inspire Cather to begin writing one of ours. In September of that year, she signs with a new publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, which publishes Youth and the Bright Medusa, a collection of short stories. We've seen some of these short stories elsewhere. She continues to publish. In 1922, one of ours is published, and she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in fiction for it. Her popularity grew with critics and readers alike. She had achieved international recognition as one of America's finest writers, and her work continued to reflect the important influences of her life. Okay. 1925, The Professor's House is published. 26, My Mortal Enemy is published. 27, Death Comes for an Archbishop. The interesting thing is that she's publishing lots and lots of material. The American Academy of Arts and Letters awards her the Howells Medal for Fiction for Death Comes to the Archbishop. In 1931, Cather's mother dies in California. She visits Red Cloud for the last time in 1931. Okay, let's see. In 1934, one of her pieces of fiction was adapted in Hollywood. It was entitled A Lost Lady. Cather vows not to permit further adaptation of her fiction for cinematic works. She later makes this an express provision of her will. She did not like to lose control of her work. And when it got to Hollywood, of course, we've seen this. Fiction is adapted to fit the screen. And Cather did not care for this at all. In 1938, She is elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the ultimate accolade for an American cultural figure. She continues to publish. She becomes friends with Sigrid Undset, the Norwegian novelist, who had been exiled from her country by the Nazi occupation. They shared an interest in botany and democratic values. Cather continues to publish Hard Punishments in 1940, which was subsequently destroyed by Edith Lewis in compliance with Cather's request. 1947, Cather dies on April 24th from a massive cerebral hemorrhage in her Park Avenue apartment in New York. She is buried in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. More short fiction was published posthumously in 1972. Lewis dies, so Lewis outlived her by quite a number of years, more than 20 years. She dies in an apartment she shared with Cather 1 year before Cather's centennial. Some key points about her. She is a rarity among writers, a woman who has managed to escape classification as a woman writer. As a novelist, she's closely identified with a particular region, but has nevertheless avoided the label regional writer. It is the depth and the universality of the themes that run through her work that have allowed Cather to transcend such limiting definitions of her voice as a writer, permitting its individuality to achieve full critical recognition. Central to much of her work is Cather's fascination with the men and women who struggle to build lives for themselves and their families in sometimes hostile environments of the American frontier. So perhaps your view of Cather was that she was limited to a region, but it's the universality that takes her out of that. As the daughter of a farmer and briefly a homesteader, Cather was intimately acquainted with the conditions faced by the pioneers, many of them immigrants adjusting to new lives far from their native lands, and the level of courage, endurance, patience, and strength that was demanded of them in their efforts to tame the frontier. This becomes relevant because while the Song of the Lark is the process of character becoming an artist, there are these elements of courage, endurance, patience, and strength that we see in Thea. In books such as O Pioneers and My Antonia, Cather creates vivid fictional portraits of the individuals who peopled the world of her Nebraska childhood. But we see that too in the development of Thea, who seeks to achieve those frozen high points that Cather so admired in Olive Fremstead. Her sensitivity to the problems faced by the immigrant homesteaders is especially acute, and her admiration for their ability to outlast the difficulties awaiting them in their new land is boundless. And we see that in Thea as she progresses towards herself as artist. We see those same characteristics. In Cather's world, the pioneer experience draws on the depths of individuals' characters. Her particular talent lies in her ability to translate this experience into universal terms, turning a pioneer woman's simple life into a glowing tribute to the human spirit. And that is what we see in Thea, the tribute to the human spirit. Cather sees in her characters, as she did in figures surrounding her in her youth, people whose individual stories of courage and endurance form a heroic pattern that changed the face of a nation. Hand in hand with Cather's reverence for this kind of developing spirit is her admiration for individuality. One of the recurring themes in her work is that of the individual whose dreams and ambitions place him or her at odds with society, outside the norms. The choices a person makes and the repercussions those choices have is the theme. The Song of the Lark and the Professor's House carry these themes throughout. In the former, the Song of the Lark, a singer sacrifices everything for her career. That's key here. Leaving behind her Midwestern home and family and relegating her social life to secondary status in order to pursue her dream. And that's what Cather believed was necessary in order for her or any artist to really reach the pinnacle. When she has achieved her goals, she is able to look back, this is Taya, clear-eyed on the decisions she has made along the way and expect that they were necessary in obtaining her goal. For Cather, this was a highly personal subject, and the novel's storyline has many similarities to her own life, which is why it's so important to establish Cather in her own context. The life of Willa Cather, for some reason, included a pronunciation here in case you weren't able to pronounce her name, Kath-UHR. I'm not even sure why I included that. Though she became identified in the minds of her readers with Nebraska, the setting for much of her fiction, she actually lived the first 9 years in Virginia. We know that. This was interesting. Although many biographies report the year of her birth as 1874, and her tombstone reads 1876, her actual year of birth was 1873. S.S. McClure, founder of McClure's Magazine, suggested the first alteration when he hired Cather as one of his editors in 1906, while she herself chose 1876 on the publication of Youth and the Bright Medusa in 1920. Though almost every picture ever taken of Cather shows a round-faced, kindly-looking Midwestern farm woman in midi blouse and tie, she actually lived half her life in New York. First in Greenwich Village and later on Park Avenue. That was the apartment that she shared with Lewis on Park Avenue. Her plain, almost masculine appearance served her well, both in the male world of journalism and later as an adjunct to her distinctly American fiction. In later life, she would wear bright, sometimes almost garish colors and prints. Let's see, according to Maxwell Geismar, he's a critic and an author, in time, Cather's high regard for the courage and industry of the pioneers seemed to become a deep hatred for the modern world. The dichotomy between the depth of the experience of the pioneers and the developing, almost she views it as a corruption of the modern world. She was, and this is a quote, an aristocrat in an egalitarian order, an agrarian in an industrial order, a defender of the spiritual graces in the midst of an increasingly materialistic culture. Of course, she lived through witnessing World War I and II. So, I'm supposed to page 1. So this chapter is entitled Recognition of Cather's Art. Two facts of Willa Cather's life, one somewhat legendary and the other somewhat prosaic, defined her as an artist. The legendary one, her uprooting in 1883 at the age of 9 from the Virginia hills to the rugged Nebraska prairie, sparked her creativity. The more prosaic fact, her journalistic and editorial apprenticeship in Lincoln, Pittsburgh, and New York, disciplined that creativity. One forgets in entertaining our favorite image of a girl making the round on her horse from one old Czech housewife to another, old Swedish one that Cather spent several years as managing editor of McClure's. Interesting, isn't it? Dealing with established authors as well as literary neophytes before going into fiction full-time at the age of 39. The experimental nature of her fiction is as little recognized as her extended apprenticeship by the general reader, but one need merely consider the variety of fictional shapes of books as diverse as Death Comes to the Archbishop, and even in the short piece of fiction, Paul's Case. Cather has survived her season of neglect. For a while, she kind of disappeared into obscurity. Her fiction during the past dozen years has generated significant criticism and analysis. While the total effect of this renewed activity is yet to be felt, perhaps the coming generation will witness the classroom fulfillment of Henry James's biographer Leon Edel's prophecy. I'm going to put myself out on a limb, says Edel, but I think the time will come when she'll be ranked above Hemingway. Interesting. When is this book published? Let's see. This was in 1984. And we certainly have seen her gain respectability and admiration. But then Edel adds, but I've got her below Faulkner. One is reminded at this point of Wallace Stevens' estimate of Cather to a friend. We have nothing better than she is. She takes so much pains to conceal her sophistication that it is easy to miss her quality. Much recent criticism has been devoted to revealing the sophistication and quality. Then increased attention has been given to Song of the Lark. Of course, that's what we're doing. This attested to Cather's growing stature as a novelist. I guess we're contributing to that. Mencken responded positively and negatively to Smart Set, another work of her fiction, enthusiastically comparing the novel to the Cinderella fable and the heroine Thea's worshipping males to Galahad's, but restricting his endorsement on the first half. Let's see. Okay. 39 to 40. This book is a collection of critical works about Willa Cather. It says critical essays on Willa Cather. So I've got them all right here at my fingertips. This one is Willa Cather and the Tradition. It's written by Edward A. and Lillian Bloom. They continue, there is a steadiness about Willa Cather's fiction that defies the cross-currents of the literary age in which she lived and wrote. Like many conscientious American writers, she was profoundly aware of the growing cleavage in her society between moral values and expedient action. Dislocations following the military and economic disasters she witnessed in her lifetime caused her to share a widespread fear that the future was bleakly uncertain, that a spiritual chaos threatened the central purpose of existence. More than most thoughtful Americans, perhaps, she was personally sensitive to devalued conduct and customs, the world wars, of course. Because she had conscientiously built her life upon a structure of traditions, because she had preferred the solid virtues of an inspiring past to the mercurial shifts of practical reality, she suspiciously resisted change. From time to time, she protested against the violation of durable truths, although rarely in the clamorous voice used by many contemporary writers. Given the fullest expression of the 19th century, the tradition is synthesized in the fiction of Cooper, Hawthorne, Melville, and James. Although they differed in their reactions To the convulsions afflicting an America in flux, they were unified by certain connections of personal responsibility. It was interesting that these authors are setting Cather in those American greats. In every essential detail, Willa Cather aspired towards the ethical and creative goals of the great tradition, consequently becoming the 20th century successor of these four 19th century novelists. It really puts her in a realm of the American greats.